I'm Laura Blackett. Currently, I work for Friends of Youth organization, which is a nonprofit that serves homeless youth. I'm a senior manager of special projects and risk, which means I just kind of have my hands in all the pots and do whatever needs to be done. Previously, for the past 20 years, I've been in education. I was a teacher for 10 years. Took some time off to raise my babies, but still worked for the Latino Outreach Project for Washington State, for leadership retreats and in meetings and assemblies. I'm trying to think of the word. I need more coffee this morning. The gray is killing
That's all
me.
right. I've only had 2 cups.
Just 2 cups. I've only had
One
one.
one of the things that kind of connected us was our passion for and our experience in diversity and working with diverse populations, diverse people, and diversity is a very inclusive word that originally, I think, when 20, 25 years ago, people thought, well, it's just about race, and now we know it's about everything really, and unique about individuals. And one of the topics that has been a really popular topic just here at Sound and in other circles that I travel in has been how can you be an ally to people? A lot of times people, I think, fall victim to something I like to call PC paralysis. They want to be PC, they want to be respectful, but they get into situations where maybe something is said that's offensive, or they wonder, is it really offensive? Should I be offended? But more important, how can we support other diverse, marginalized, minority individuals, whatever label you want to give them? And I just want to get some of your thoughts on that.
So it depends on what you're talking about, what suggestions I would give. If you're talking about an entity or an organization, then right now we're kind of in this pivotal place where it's just beyond anti-bias training, anti-racist training. They're showing that only works so much. To really impact the culture of an organization, you really have to make structural changes. You have to have it in your HR policies. You have to have it in the way you evaluate people. That is very Eurocentric and biased in just the way we define what professionalism is considered. So there's that piece where you have to have that strategy. Now, a lot of directors of diversity, equity, and inclusion are looking at how do we structurally change organizations so that they're hospitable places for people of color to work. And so there's that piece. Then there's the piece, which I work with a lot of educators on, how do you make your classroom culturally responsive? How do you have it so that the content is open to everybody and it's not just open to people who come with the Eurocentric cultural frame of reference? Then there's that personal piece where if you're an ally and someone says something stupid, how do you say something? And so when you send me bring those up, there's different strategies for that. And so it depends on where people are in their development of how to be an ally. But I even at this point want to kind of change that vernacular to a co-conspirator in the fight against oppression and racism, right? Because then if I'm a co-conspirator, there's a lot more responsibility placed on me, where it's not, we're in it together, and it's not a charge led by people of color that I'm just there to help along when it's convenient. It's, no, this is my job now. And how do I do that in a way that's respectful of people of color and not dripping in white privilege, saying, I'm going to take charge, I'm going to rescue the world, I'm going to do this, but also taking responsibility for the fact that I do have privilege in this world because I am white. I have a lot of privilege because I'm white and educated. And how do I disrupt systems using that privilege without perpetuating that privilege, right? So it's very layered. So I'm if you're just talking about a person who's starting out on their journey, if you're talking about that piece, I'm going to just kind of bring it down to a personal level at this point. It's just, as a co-conspirator in the fight against racism, there's things that you need to do um, when you hear something offensive or something just makes the hairs on your neck raise. If that happens, then something's wrong, right? And a couple of things that I was really thinking about since the last time we talked, just simple things, because we don't want to make it so hard, right? It is hard, but what's a step forward, right? So the first thing I want allies or co-conspirators to know is that if you speak up, 70% of the time it's not going to go over well. Just accept that, right? If it's at a family dinner and you love Uncle Johnny, but Uncle Johnny's a racist, right? You're gonna say something to him knowing that it's not going to impact how he speaks or changes, most likely, right? And also looking at what racism really is that we have in our mind that racism is this evil. It's evil, but we're looking at, I'm not a racist. I like Black people. I have Black friends, right? And I would never not hire someone because they're Black. I have a Black boss and I love him, or things like that. That's not the kind of racism we're talking about. It's the very covert, implicit bias that our brains are trained to think. And really unpacking that. Book that I really think is a good book to start, and that I've used with my teachers and other trainings that I've done. I've done trainings with superintendents and principals around the state of Washington, is Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain by Zanetta Hammond, or Zaretta. I wanted to make sure I say her name right. They're really understanding your own culture first, understanding how that impacts how your brain works, understanding how your cultural frame of reference just really forms the way you view the world, how you approach situations, how being white in America does have its culture. It's very varied, like every culture, but there's an underlying current that is similar, that gives us access to content in classroom, gives us access to the culture of business, gives us access to the culture of the grocery store, just everyday dealings that give us access to just the dominant culture. That if we start realizing our cultural frame of reference, then it's easy to see how other people's culture make things, when it's not open to them, it's not their fault at all, right? And that's a thing where my teachers were like, oh, just light bulbs went off everywhere, how they understood how the way they just had something as simple as the job chore board structured was very Eurocentric and wasn't hospitable or open to a lot of their children that come from communal type cultural archetypes, which is a majority of our children of color. And that's also another thing, is that you don't have to sit down and find out all the nuances of a culture in like 1 week when you have 29 different cultures you're dealing with. No, look at the cultural archetypes and the generalities and the juxtapositions of that with the very individualistic cultural archetype that is white America. And there's, different varying degrees of that, but that helps you kind of break it down, that piece. So I always started with that, when people could understand that their own culture impact so much of their brain development and how when you get stressed, you go right into your implicit bias, then it's a very natural, easy step to start looking into racialized structuralization, right? And then implicit bias, and then it's not like this huge shock, right? So if you really look in the brain science, and I know my white people really love science and data, and that's me. That's how I cope. That's how I research the hell out of stuff, and really unpack that piece. So that's one way I think you could start really understanding your own culture and the nuances of it and how it breaks down to view things. Another thing I was thinking about was when you have a gut reaction about something, and an interaction with a person of color, or a gut reaction to call CPS or anything like that, step back and check it, right? Because a lot of times your gut reaction is informed by your implicit bias. Your implicit bias was formed by your cultural frame of reference, which is formed because you're white American. You can't get away from implicit bias if you're white. It's scientifically impossible, right? We are raised with that. It's in our lizard brain. So when you have a gut reaction, instead of come back and go, okay, is there some implicit bias that is going here? I did a lot of work with my white female teachers, especially dealing with Black moms, because the way Black women and white women communicate tend to be a little different. And white women didn't know how to maneuver that. And it's also, they would be scared to call the Black mothers because it would be very direct, very forward speaking. And I'm like, they're not thinking anything different than any other mom, except there's this history of oppression and racism and not being able to trust teachers or the school system. They're protecting their child. Even though a white woman would communicate that in a different way, the intent's the same. And I would say, what's your gut reaction? Why are you afraid of this mom? And have you even spoken to her? Do you know how she's going to speak to you? What's your implicit bias? Why is this coming up for you? I'd be more than happy to step in. But that means that relationship is going to be built with me and not with you, and I take your power away.
Well, you mentioned, I'm sorry to interrupt you, because you've answered about 5 or 6 questions I was going to ask you just
right
in this last,
get me
monologue.
going.
Well, you mentioned it's a very multi-layered topic anyway.
Yeah.
I think that you've touched on some really key points. One is you just mentioned that, there's history here. There's history between the races, between, the gay, lesbian, straight community. I mean, so when somebody walks into your office and they're a client or a student or whatever, you can't just resort back to this default of, well, I don't see color. I just treat everybody as individuals. I treat everybody nice. And if I just do that, that's all I need to do. Because there are preconceptions, there are history, there is a lack of trust very often with you mentioned the education system, but also in the medical, and especially with the police. I mean, I think a lot of the police altercations that have escalated have been because there's things on both sides that have not been examined. You mentioned another key point, I think, and that people need to look inward before they look outward. And I'm sure you've run into this in my past and working with nonprofits. A lot of times I would be brought in as a consultant. It's like, well, we want to do outreach. What should we do? Let's have a celebration and honor Dr. Martin Luther King, or have Cinco de Mayo or whatever, and then check the box and move on. But what I'm hearing you're saying is that it's a new mindset. It's a commitment, an ongoing, lifelong commitment. It can't just be something like, like raising your kids. You don't just discipline them or interact with them one week and say, okay, I'm done. I don't have to talk to them for another month or so or deal with it.
If that was that easy.
It's an ongoing commitment, and you got to be willing to be uncomfortable. Like you said, Uncle Bob is saying racist things at the Thanksgiving dinner. Well, if you're going to bring something up, you're now confronting a man who's maybe it's taken 50 years of programming for him to get that way, and you're not going to undo it or change his mind. And a 20-minute conversation about the value of diversity. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I
no,
wanted
that's
to know.
okay. And you reel me back in, because I will go and I'm going to try to stay on point. But it's speaking of Uncle John, and that's the thing. So I was just thinking about breaking it down as being a co-conspirator. Do your work. Understand how your cultural frame of reference impacts how you view the world, right? You have to know that before you can do any work. You have to accept that that is a reality. It is a scientific reality. You can't get around that. You have to accept it, that you are human and indeed racist, or definitely have implicit bias that you resort to, especially in time of stress. And then when you're talking about confronting people, here's the thing is that, and I had this when I was in Bellevue, right after I graduated from graduate school, and I was homeless. So I was living with my sister because I just came back from the East Coast with my 3 kids, didn't have a place to live. And I'm sleeping on her living room floor with my 3 kids, and very thankful because she's feeding me, she's giving me gas money till I get my first paycheck. And her best friend just said some racist stuff, and I would just be like, I have to keep a place of peace for my survival, for my children, and be grateful and thankful that my sister's taking care of me. Because my sister never said any of this thing, but her best friend would come over and just say, I'm not a racist. I'm like, you just basically said you hate Mexican people. And this is a group that I've worked with for 10 years. And I was bringing this up to someone in the Department of Equity at Bellevue, and she said, Laura, first of all, you have to be able to take care of you have Maslow's, you have to survive. And she said, so you might not always be able to say anything, but what do you think you're going to change her mind? And I said, no, but she says it in front of my children. She said, there you go. Having these battles, it's exhausting because you're going to have to say it all the time. You're going to engage in these conversations all the time, because when you start noticing the very covert racist things people say and bigoted things people say about the LGBTQ community, you're always going to have something to say. And so when it comes to my family, I realize that I'm not going to change how they feel. Also, when you add on the family dynamics of, they just see me as Laura, not the person that's an expert in anything, right? I'll let it go because I know I'm not going to change, and I'm not going to expend that energy, that soul energy. But if there's children there, even though I know I can't change that person's mind, the children are going to be hearing what I say and observing how I said something, even though it's not going to go well. Mm-hmm. So that's like, okay, maybe it's me thinking forward. My children are going to see this. My children have seen me done this so many times. My children now do it, right? And I've raised social activists, and sorry world, they're going to be very annoying, and I'm quite proud of that, right? But that piece, like, really think about it. If there's children involved, say it. And then another thing that I had was I had written it down for things about and then also just a way to start, if you're really just thinking, having these conversations, what are the things that come up the most with people? What do they say? And just have a few pieces of data, because again, why people like their data, they like their research. And then you also feel you're armed with something other than you just know it's wrong. To say that
To
to
back it
them.
up.
Yeah. And sometimes if it's just you and them and they're saying something, then just let it go. Or if they say something in front of somebody, you have to gauge whether you I just recently a white man just talk about how he felt like he could talk here, where he came from an organization where his voice wasn't heard and they were so into equity that they shut his voice down. And I sat there and I was like, you've got to be kidding me, because you are always the first one to speak and you always have something to say. And okay, anyway, but I decided at that time embarrassing him and calling him out in front of 50 people wasn't the best thing.
Probably
And
not.
then the people of color in the room were kind of like rolling their eyes and they didn't want to say anything again. So I did circle back around and talk to him privately about it. And I also let the people of color know that that's what I was going to do. And um, also a check-in is, am I overstepping my bounds? I'm going to check him, a white woman to white man. And they're like, thank you. And I said, and I did, it didn't go over very well. But he did have some time to reflect on it. And he also knew that I was watching him. So the next meeting, he let someone else actually speak first. So um, even though it didn't go over well, there might be something now that he's starting to think about. And it's a small win, but someone else got to speak.
Well, and there's a feeling of some type of accomplishment. I think of the term growing pains, any kind of growth, whether it be in a marriage, with your kids, you're going to hit bumps in the road. I mean, how many times have your kids, 2 years later said, Mom, you were right 2 years ago when you said X, Y, Z. So, and that goes back to what I was just saying about it's a commitment. It's a commitment to deal with the bumps in the road, to deal with the discomfort, to deal with the, conflict that might arise. Because
And the
ultimately,
backlash.
yeah, and ultimately though, racism, sexism, bias, it's going to come out one way or another. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not like, it's like cancer. You might ignore the tumor, and it might disappear, but it's going to come back. And when it comes back, it's going to be even bigger. So it doesn't go away. So you might as well do something proactive. I need to
Mm-hmm.
wrap this part of our interview up. I want to have you back. So I want to do, Laura Blackett part 2, maybe 3. I want to get some feedback based on what you've said from some of our staff. And then that would kind of inform us as far as what we can kind of address in the future. But it is a multi-layered, deeply layered topic that isn't, dealt with by just having an ethnic celebration once a year.